This was an attack on the Jewish Museum of Washington. The shockwaves of what happens here reverberate in so many different places.
I'm hearing utter despair. I lived in Gaza for many years. Worse than hunger, worse than knowing that there is no safe place to go, is the fact that there is no horizon for this to end.
This entire posturing over will they or won't they recognize a Palestinian state, I think is totally playing into Netanyahu's hand.
Israel doesn't feel the need to end its subjugation of Palestinians. It will only feel that if it is pushed to.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy. Last night in Washington, 2 Israeli diplomats were shot dead by a gunman outside the Jewish Museum in the capital, and the Israeli government has reacted with the fury that you would imagine. But they have also blamed the reactions and comments of European politicians like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron in France for their criticism of Israel. And they have effectively said that what they have accused Israel of doing has been blood libel and anti-Semitism and has led to this kind of attack in which 2 Israelis have been killed. All the while, of course, the crisis in Gaza continues. A small number of lorries carrying aid has crossed the border, but it's not clear how much of it has been distributed yet. And in any case, it's a fraction of the daily need. And the warnings of children and adults starving in Gaza goes on. Joining me for this forecast, the Palestinian journalist and analyst Nour Odeh and the Israeli correspondent for The Economist, Anshel Pfeffer. Thank you both very much indeed for joining me. Anshel, can I ask you, the Israeli Prime Minister and his diaspora minister have been scathing about European leaders and clearly blaming them for what has happened overnight in Washington with this gunman's attack. Is that how Israel will see it broadly, how most people will see it there?
Well, there's a massive dispute within Israel about the continuation of the war, and I think that while you're seeing these statements that are being made by Netanyahu and by other ministers in English for international consumption, it's very much about an internal debate about the government trying to justify its plans and actions regarding Gaza and trying to squelch the internal opposition. And the recent polls have shown that over 60% of Israelis, so a clear majority, are against continuing this war.
Because what people like Starmer and Macron have said, is nowhere near as strong as Israeli opposition politicians.
Well, it's always different when you hear it from your own politicians, from your own people, when a debate is held internally than when a debate is held outside the country. And obviously, more Israelis will feel protective of their country, and when you do hear things which are being said outside of Israel, and some things are, I think, quite clearly are verging on anti-Semitism. Not what Keir Starmer says. I think what Keir Starmer's criticism of Israeli actions, I think, is very measured, and I don't think anybody in their right mind would accuse him of anti-Semitism. But there are these tones which do exist, I think, quite widespread through a lot of the protests that we've seen in the West in the last 19 months. To expect Israelis to be able to, at the time of war, to differentiate between these things, I think is perhaps a bit of a high bar. And it is easy for politicians like Netanyahu to muddy the waters in that way.
Nour, how do you think Palestinians will see what happened in Washington last night?
Well, to be honest, the first reaction that I've seen from a lot of commentators is that this diverts attention. This is an attack that will deflect from the atrocities being committed in Gaza. It will allow Netanyahu to exploit them, to focus on...
Actually, there's an air raid siren here, which you may be hearing in the background, which probably means that there's a missile being launched from Yemen. I don't know if you can hear it, but just continue. But it may intrude. I'm in a safe room, so
you don't have to leave.
No.
Sorry, no, go on.
No, I think people. The first thing that people thought of is how Netanyahu will exploit this. How Netanyahu will use this attack to accuse anybody calling out the crimes that are being committed, accusing them of anti-Semitism, conflating the criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which is both dangerous and factually incorrect. And so there is that fear and that anticipation, if you will, judging by previous conduct of Israeli government, especially right-wing politicians like Netanyahu, that this is going to happen. And of course, sure enough, this is what we've heard from the Israeli government. We've heard them launch attacks at the Israeli opposition leaders, telling them that their criticisms of the war encouraged anti-Semitism, encouraged leaders abroad to also criticize Israel and take action, and that all of that is somehow fueling anti-Semitism, and in a way bringing that to the top of the news agenda, while the starvation, the blockade, the mass killings in Gaza continue, and the displacement in the West Bank, of course, also continues to happen below the radar.
I mean, there's no suggestion at this stage that this had anything to do with a targeted killing by Hamas or its supporters. In fact, the suspect who's been arrested seems to have a Latin name. But obviously they are Israeli government servants. They are diplomats. And Palestinians in Gaza are being targeted if they have any connection to the Hamas government there. So do you think people will be horrified by this kind of shooting, or will they say, well, our people are being killed for, any link to the government, they are effectively legitimate targets?
I think that will cross many people's minds, but to be honest with you, there are far more pressing issues on the minds of Palestinians than to focus on this attack, tragic as it were. Israel has carried out dozens, if not more, of political assassinations around the world for decades. So this is not something that is an unknown entity, if you will, for Palestinians. They've been targeted politically and assassinated. Palestinian diplomats have been killed in European capitals before. And again, this is not going to be the top issue on Palestinians' mind. They're worried about their loved ones getting a loaf of bread. They're waiting for the announcement that some bakeries may be operational, may have a limited number of bread, and then they have to worry about whether they will have a chance. They will be one of the few lucky ones who can actually get to the bread before it runs out. That's the top of the agenda for Palestinians in Gaza, but also those outside of it, like me, who are worried about their loved ones there.
Yes, and I want to focus on the situation in Gaza in a moment. But Anshel, I mean, in terms of the targeting of Israelis outside, I mean, this will have a sort of a terrifying effect on Jewish communities around the world, I would imagine, in that people will presumably feel they are potentially the targets of a growing fury, and they will fear copycat kind of killings. I mean, how concerned are people by the fact that opposition to what Israel is doing right now seems to be growing?
Well, it's not a new phenomenon. We've seen this happen so many times in the past. I mean, this was not an attack on it. I mean, the casualties happened to be 2 employees of the Israeli embassy, but this was an attack on the Jewish Museum of Washington, not on the Israeli embassy. That has to be made clear. And the shockwaves of what happens here reverberate in so many different places and impact on so many different communities, and Jewish communities around the world have. And you've seen that in Britain, you've seen that in so many countries. And I recently did for the Economist a piece going to a number of countries, talking to Jewish communities, and seeing the level of security which they've been forced, not just themselves adopting it, but also the local police and governments making sure that there's massive cordons of armed police around every Jewish synagogue and school in many places around the world, and not just in countries where you would think Jews are vulnerable, but in stable Western, what would hopefully be stable Western societies. So this has now happened in Washington, the capital of the United States. It's not just some obscure outpost. And as you mentioned, the guy who apparently carried this out doesn't seem to be of Arab or Muslim or Palestinian descent. He's got a Latino name. So the people who are paying attention to this and the people who are being impacted by this are of many diverse groups. And the fact that you're even doing this podcast on this conflict, which is in a one small place. It's not just one small conflict. It happens and it's affecting so many people. And just now there was a missile launched from Yemen, which is over 1,000 miles away from here, a country which doesn't even have a border with Israel. It's just the way there's so many ways in which this conflict is being perceived and understood and reported upon and felt. And as Nour said, each side will be magnifying its own victims. And I think she's right. I don't think Palestinians in any way will be thinking, well, poor Israelis who were killed, or Israeli employees, I'm not quite sure if they were citizens who were killed last night in Washington. We have so many victims of our own, and Israel has been focused for the past 19 months on the victims of the October 7 massacre. It really is a kind of choose your side or choose your victim sort of story. And as much as I think news organizations try and cover the victims on both sides with equal empathy, with equal attention, A, it's not possible, and B, every side will be focusing on its victims, on its suffering, and that's to a very large degree what continues to fuel this conflict.
But is the condemnation of European leaders making Israelis think at all about what Netanyahu is doing and criticize it? You know, are the images of starving children getting through to Israeli media in any sense, and are people worried about it? You know, are they saying, you know, that sense that suddenly in Britain now the government is now saying, okay, this is intolerable. For 18 months it was tolerable, but now this is intolerable. You know, is anybody in Israel having a similar kind of reaction?
There are some people, but it's mainly on the margins, because ultimately Israeli society has been focused for the last 19 months and will continue to be focused for the foreseeable future on the suffering of Israelis. And I think it's natural. I don't think there is a society anywhere in the world in any point in history which focused on the suffering of the other side. I mean, a society at war. And this expectation that Israelis should be looking, I mean, I would love for Israelis to be looking at the suffering on the Palestinian side. I'm, you know, beyond being a journalist, I'm a lefty liberal Israeli. I would be very happy for my for my fellow Israeli citizens to be also looking at the suffering on this side. But at the same time, I'm mindful that it's not something natural. Societies at war do not focus on the suffering of the other side. And the reason that the majority of Israelis want the war to end is because of Israeli suffering and because of Israeli hostages who have been still being held in Gaza for over 19 months now. And I think it's the same thing with the Palestinians. Why would the Palestinians be focusing on the suffering of Israelis? Society, you know, I mean, I'd really be fascinating to hear of an example of any society which looked at the enemy side with empathy at a time of war. It just doesn't happen. And to expect that either of Israelis or of Palestinians is to hold both of these societies to standards which are simply not natural or not human.
No, I mean, let's talk about what's going on in the ground then. I mean, at the moment, after 11 weeks of an aid blockade, a trickle of aid is getting in, but the situation is clearly very dire. And people are also now being pushed again. They're being displaced again as part of this Israeli plan, restated last night by Netanyahu to take over the whole of Gaza security and move the Palestinians into a small area. I mean, what are you hearing on the ground right now?
I'm hearing utter despair. I lived in Gaza for many years. I have lifelong loved ones and friends there, and I've never heard them sound the way they have the past few weeks. They are hungry. They are well-to-do. They're better off than most people in Gaza, and yet they can barely scrape one small meal a day. Many of them are grinding pasta and lentils in order to bake some bread to give, especially the kids, something that they can chew on because there's nothing else that they can do. But the situation for the vast majority is much worse than that. I know and I've seen people kids picking leaves off of trees and eating them because there's simply nothing else to eat. And worse than hunger, worse than knowing that there is no safe place to go, is the fact that there is no horizon for this to end. And I think, speaking to what Anshel was talking about, I think it's important to highlight, yes, it would be impossible for Palestinians to focus on Israeli suffering or the shooting incident, but Palestinians have been following Jewish organizations and their voice that champions their humanity, and they've been touched by it. They do differentiate between Israel, their occupier, their oppressor, and Judaism and Jews around the world, and they know that they have allies among them. It is very different, the dynamic for Palestinians as a people under occupation, looking outwards, waiting for a solution from abroad because they know that's where it's going to come from. And for Israelis who have the privilege of being the stronger side, the one with the military, the one with the planes, the one with the international support, the ones who don't need to see the Palestinians. And Palestinians are aware of that even when they talk to their Israeli friends and allies who oppose the occupation, who try to highlight Palestinian victims in marches in Tel Aviv and get chastised by it. I understand the difficulty of that dynamic, that Israelis feel pain and don't want to see it. But we have to recognize that the language normalizing the demonization, dehumanization of Palestinians that predates October 7, predates these atrocities, is what got us here. It's easy not to see Palestinians if you're Israeli. It's easy not to see them as human. And so it's easy not to expect any solidarity or empathy. It explains why Israeli media is not flooded with pictures of starving children and of bombed out hospitals and of mothers who are losing their hair, of little girls who no longer have hair because of malnutrition and fear and so on. So the dynamic here is a lot older and a lot deeper than the current 19 months. And I think it's important for your viewers to always remember that, because it is not as simple as October 7 happened and the Israelis are angry and in pain, and they want this to be over because they're in pain. It's a lot longer than that, even though Israeli society is still in denial about the fact that it is the oppressor in this equation.
But just as I asked Anshel about whether people are beginning to question Netanyahu because of the international reaction and what's actually happening on the ground, I mean, some weeks ago we did see the beginnings of some anger in Gaza towards Hamas and some protests. To what extent has that been stifled or just waned away naturally? And how much anger is there still there that they are in this situation because of their political leaders?
Look, there is a lot of anger, and I think, thank you for the question, because it's a chance to remind everybody that not everybody in Gaza is a Hamas supporter or a Hamas member. In fact, quite the opposite. When elections were held in 2006, the majority of votes in Gaza did not go to Hamas. In fact, Gaza voters gave Fatah a lot more votes than they did Hamas. So there is that. The fact that Hamas controls Gaza doesn't mean that the population there is the popular base of Hamas. That is a historic inaccuracy. There is very real anger in Gaza. There have been protests, and in fact, these protests have continued. And as you would expect, they're difficult. They're met with a lot of force and a lot of condemnation, even by people who are not happy with Hamas, saying that this is not the time for it. Listen to what the Israelis are saying. The Israelis are saying that even if the war ends, what they want is Gaza without the Palestinians. What Smotrich and Likud members are talking about is not just getting rid of Hamas for those who oppose Hamas. It is getting rid of the Palestinians. Israel has a Palestinian problem that it wants to resolve, and it feels that like it has a historic opportunity now to solve it. So it's a very tricky thing to for a Palestinian to say this is all Hamas's fault. The discussion on October 7, whether on its legitimacy, on the fact that Hamas brought on or gave Israel a chance to unleash unprecedented brutality, is happening, and it's been happening since the beginning. Now it's getting a lot more attention, but it is there. It cannot reach its natural end or conclusion while the bombs keep falling. That just, it won't happen, unfortunately.
Okay, so let's talk to both of you about the sort of the politics of progress now, and what victory or resolution or peace might look like. There's a sort of a building momentum around the idea that more countries could recognize a Palestinian state, possibly even including Britain and France in this UN meeting in June. And that's what the Palestinian Authority spokespeople have been constantly calling for, saying, recognize us first as a sort of a political step, as a precursor to negotiations. I mean, what do people really think that would achieve towards a peace?
I mean, it's something that will certainly be for the Palestinians an important diplomatic milestone, but I don't think it would have any effect whatsoever on the ground. There's been talk of a Palestinian state for as long as there's been almost as long as there's been this conflict, and the idea of a state just coming into being because diplomats somewhere will say, well, we recognize that concept, doesn't mean that it's going to happen. And we've spent so many years and countless interviews and podcasts like this as well, discussing the viability of a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, a one-state solution, a bi-national confederation solution. The problem with all these words is never what are the mechanics of having a state or two states or three states, which is in some ways what the situation was with Hamas being in charge of Gaza. But the word solution, and the word solution means doesn't just mean some kind of idea. It means that there are two nations who do not accept each other's existence on a relatively slender piece of land, which both this is a national religious conflict in which two nations believe that they have a God-given right to a small piece of land. And to solve that, you have to have at least a significant majority in both nations and the political leadership who are willing to solve that. The word here is solution, not one state or two states. If there was a consensus that a solution can be found, then that's not. Then the way to reach it would be, okay, we could deal with that. But the fact is that there is a majority, I think, of Israelis and Palestinians today, and certainly the political leaderships of both sides, who are not at that point where they're willing to accept the fact that two nations have to and can share, whether it's in division or sharing or any other type of way of doing it. And just saying, okay, we'll have two states and we'll recognize the Palestinian state is not going to push Israelis or Palestinians any closer to that day. And that really can't come, I don't think it's going to come from the outside. I think it's a process that both societies have to go through. There was a brief moment in which, in the 90s with the Oslo process, where it did seem that there may be a majority and the political leadership on both sides for that. That was a fleeting moment. It didn't last. And I think if we see anything from October 7, it shows that there are on both sides still very, very powerful forces who are unwilling to recognize, religious forces. We have to, it's very difficult in the West to accept that there is such thing as a religious war, because for Western people, that's something which existed in the Middle Ages, and somehow we've evolved beyond that. And religion is suddenly this wonderful, benign thing. And we have smiling popes and all holy men are good men. No, they're not. Many holy men and many young men who call out in the name of God when they go into battle are bloodthirsty and hate their neighbors. And this is what we're seeing now. When the Hamas attackers on October 7 attacked Israel, they didn't shout down with Zionism or down with the settlers or down with Cologne. They did shout Allahu Akbar. And the same thing is happening for many young Israelis going into the battle when they're making prayers. Has been for most of it, the roots of the conflict are religious, of the history of religion, and it's still a huge part. It's not the only part. And Westerners and people like Nour, I think, who want to talk to Westerners will try and use Western words like colonialism. This is not a post-colonial thing. This is mainly a religiously motivated war. And until the sides will be able to somehow align their ideas of God-given promises with reality and with a better future, it will continue to be one.
No.
There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, no, this is not a religious conflict. This is a conflict that born out of the dispossession of a people who have deep roots to the land, the denial of their existence and their rights, in that case, the Palestinian people. That's where the conflict is. The fact that there are religious fanatics who are now ruling over in Israel, and that there is a religious political movement in Palestine that does also employ religion to foment its position in the national struggle, does not make this a religious conflict, at least not from a Palestinian perspective. We are Muslims and Christians and other minorities. We have a very solid secular base of the national movement, and we don't view this in religious terms.
But there is religious hatred, isn't there? I mean, that is expressed by the fighters
there isn't.
and by the people.
No. You've seen it. Maybe saying Allahu Akbar doesn't mean.
I don't just mean that. I mean the way that Gazans talk about Israelis is not just in terms of land.
What in terms of what then?
It's also in terms of religion.
No, they're referred to as Yahud. Yes, they're referred to as the Jews, but that's because these are the only Jews they know. But Jews, for Muslims, are people of the book. This is not about Muslims hating Jews. This is about, if Israel were a majority Muslim country, Palestinians would oppose it just the same. This is not about the religion of Israel. This is about the fact that Israel is not just colonizing Palestine. It is kicking out Palestinians. It is taking over more land. It's been doing that since 1948. It's nonstop. And the fact that genocidal religious statements are part of policy in Israel makes it worse, encourages people to evoke religious sentiments and to view this from a religious perspective. But that is not the real issue here. And when we talk about a solution, I don't like the word solution either, Anshel, but that's not because I don't want a solution, because I think we keep looking at a solution as if there is somehow parity between the two sides, and we just have to agree on something. We have to like the Israelis and find a way to make them comfortable, when Palestinians don't owe Israel that, as the colonized and the oppressed. An end to the occupation, that is the only solution, and Palestinians will determine how they will exercise their right to self-determination. Recognition in that context, to go back to your question, Krishnan, is not just symbolic. There are legal obligations attached to that recognition. And I think that is why Israeli politicians oppose it, ridicule it, view it as an anti-Israeli step.
We don't know what they would be recognizing as the trouble.
Yeah, because when you recognize Palestine, you have to make sure that you respect Palestinian sovereignty over their land. You have to respect that Israel does not have the right to be in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, that it cannot profiteer from goods produced in illegal Israeli settlements. You have to actually respect international law. And the ICJ ruling that was passed a year ago about the illegality of that occupation. That's what concerns Israeli politicians about recognitions. Of course, it's symbolic. It won't stop the bombs. It won't stop the tanks. It won't pluck out and remove the 700 and plus Israeli settlers. But it will bring with it legal obligations to those states who recognize Palestine that they have to respect. And for the UK, at least from Palestinian perspective, this is not just overdue, it's a debt. So Palestinians will view the UK recognition differently from the French or Canadian or whatever. They will view that with more significance, more historical importance, because of the history, if you will, of the UK in the region and its role in all of it.
Anshel, I mean, moves towards recognition actually help Netanyahu with his agenda, which is so far away from two-state or anything like that it's almost not worth talking about?
I don't think it would have any effect on Netanyahu in itself. I mean, on his standing. I think that he'll be able to very easily spin this as yet more of the world against us, anti-Semitic waves and attacks on Israel. It's very easy because it's just about words. It's empty diplomatic gestures, and Netanyahu has been dealing with empty diplomatic words his entire career from the days he was a diplomat. And basically, this entire posturing over will they or won't they recognize a Palestinian state, I think is totally playing into Netanyahu's hands, because it's continuing this argument detached from what's happening here on the ground. On the ground, people are starving and dying, and Gaza is being destroyed, and both sides are suffering and have been suffering for a very long time. And continuing this talk, and we're carrying this talk, we're having this conversation in English because we're using all these concepts which sound wonderful in legal terms and academic terms to Western ears. That's not what's happening here on the ground. It hasn't been. And to try and think, oh, well, when we finally get, I mean, if the sides, or if the parties who are really interested in reaching, and I think Nour and I only agree the fact that the word solution is a very bad, is a word that we need to totally sort of empty from its old meanings and try and find new meanings to it. But if all the effort is now going to be devoted to some conference in New York, which will put out a statement saying, I mean, I personally want a Palestinian state. I'm happy to see it happen in various versions. I think it's, as an Israeli, I think it'll be good for Israelis as well. But the point is that this focus on an empty diplomatic process rather than on actually trying to change the situation here on the ground takes so much of the energy. And if there really is going to be this conference in June in New York, instead of people dealing with ending the war here, which is what needs to be done, ending starvation in Gaza, ending the fighting, returning the Israeli hostages home, it'll all become about will they or won't, will France or Britain vote in favor of recognition of a Palestinian state in New York? That's 5,000 miles away. What is it going to do in the ground? It'll do nothing. It'll play in Netanyahu's hands. This is the game that he's been playing throughout his career. And if there has to be change here, it has to be pressure for real change and not an empty diplomatic gestures, I think.
No, just answer that, and then I think we'll probably leave it at that. But yeah, what's your answer to that?
And look, I think momentum is building. I think recognition in that legal political context is important, but I think it's not enough. And what countries in Europe will increasingly feel the need to do, given public opinion, given the policies of the Israeli government, is sanctions. Israel needs to feel that there are consequences, real life consequences for its actions. It cannot continue to function in the international arena with such exceptionalism, with such pampering and cuddling, while committing all these things, while standing trial for genocide, we have to remember, at the ICJ. These kinds of, that price tag to all those policies, whether it's economic sanctions, whether it's cultural sanctions, like we heard suggested from the Spanish Prime Minister, whether it's arms embargo, which we're beginning to see first in Spain and perhaps in other countries as well. These are the kinds of consequences that make not just governments, but publics at large think or rethink policies. That's how apartheid fell. It did not fall from within. It did not fall because suddenly Afrikaans woke up and said, well, apartheid is really not a good idea. Let's make this a democratic country. Israel doesn't feel the need to end its subjugation of Palestinians, to end its rule, to end its use of violence against Palestinians. It will only feel that if it is pushed to. So long as it's making a profit, economic, political, and otherwise, off of being the oppressor, it will not have an incentive to change its policy. And that's why change will come from without, not from within.
Thank you both very much indeed. Anshel, Pfeffer, Nour Odeh, thank you for your time. And that's it for the Fourcast. Until next time, Bye-bye.